It wasn't the expensive cologne lingering on his shirts or the mysterious weekend conferences that exposed my husband's betrayal. It wasn't even the lipstick smudge I found on his collar last Tuesday. No, it was the unmistakable sound of financial freefall in my banking app. $3 million gone in 2 months. What Richard didn't realize when he drained our accounts was that his betrayal had activated a dormant clause in my family's trust. A trust worth $40 million that had been silently accumulating offshore for 15 years. A trust he knew nothing about. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I first noticed something was wrong when the push notification appeared on my phone during my morning yoga session. Unusual account activity detected. I stretched into Warrior 2, reaching for my water bottle with one hand and my phone with the other, figuring it was another false alarm from the overzealous security team at Pinnacle Bank. The notification showed a $250,000 wire transfer from our joint investment account. Just yesterday. My arms dropped. This was no false alarm. Richard and I had explicitly agreed not to touch that particular account without consulting each other first. We'd built those investments meticulously over 12 years of marriage, earmarking them for our eventual retirement villa in Portugal, a dream we'd shared since our second date at that little Portuguese restaurant in Manhattan, where he'd confessed his love for pastel de nata and ocean sunsets. There must be some mistake, I murmured, abandoning my yoga routine. I called Richard immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. Hey, it's Richard Blackwell. I'm unavailable at the moment, but leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. His carefully rehearsed professional tone offered no comfort. Richard, it's me. Call me back immediately. There's an issue with our investment account. I kept my voice steady, controlled. Perhaps there was a logical explanation. A banking error, a misunderstanding. Richard was the CEO of Blackwell Quantum Technologies after all. Perhaps this was related to some emergency at the company that he hadn't had time to discuss with me. My phone remained silent as I showered and dressed for the day. I chose a crisp white blouse and charcoal pencil skirt, my armor for confrontation. As I slipped on my grandmother's sapphire earrings, the ones I wore whenever I needed her strength, I noticed Richard's side of the closet looked unusually sparse. The Louis Vuitton weekender bag he'd received for his 40th birthday was missing, along with what appeared to be several of his tailored suits. My stomach tightened. Opening my laptop, I logged into our online banking system and began methodically checking every account. Our main checking account, which typically maintained a healthy 6-figure balance for household expenses and emergencies, $3,214.76 remaining. Our joint savings account, where we'd accumulated funds for luxury purchases and vacations, $7,851.33 is remaining. The investment portfolio we'd built together, once worth over $3.2 million, now showing a balance of $891,235.04. In total, nearly $2.7 million had vanished over the past 8 weeks. Each withdrawal is carefully calculated to stay just under thresholds that would trigger immediate fraud alerts, each one authorized with Richard's credentials. Each one sent to accounts I didn't recognize. The timestamps told their own story. Withdrawals at 2:17 a.m., transfers on days when Richard had claimed to be at conferences in Seattle, Chicago, Houston. The pattern was undeniable, but my analytical mind still searched for alternative explanations. Perhaps the company was in trouble? Perhaps Richard was trying to protect our assets from some impending corporate catastrophe. My finger hovered over my phone, ready to call our accountant, when another notification popped up. This one from my American Express Platinum card. Recent charge, Van Cleef & Arpels, $47,350. I hadn't purchased any jewelry recently. The last Van Cleef piece I owned was the Alhambra necklace Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary, 2 years ago. My hands were steady as I picked up the phone again, but this time I didn't call Richard. I called Sophia Jiang, my personal attorney, who had handled my family's affairs since before I'd even met Richard. "Alexandra," Sophia answered on the second ring. "This is an unexpected pleasure. How are you?" "I need to meet with you today," I replied, bypassing pleasantries. "It appears Richard has been systematically emptying our accounts without my knowledge or consent." The brief silence on the other end carried Sophia's concern. "I can see you at 11. Bring whatever documentation you have." As I ended the call, I walked to the window of our penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. The October leaves had just started to turn, painting the landscape in golds and crimsons. Richard and I had paid $8.5 million for this view 3 years ago, leveraging a substantial portion of our liquid assets at the time. Has that been his plan all along? To build a life with me that he could slowly dismantle? I unlocked the hidden safe behind my grandmother's portrait in my home office. A safe Richard knew nothing about. Inside was a sealed envelope containing documents my father had given me on my 30th birthday, 5 years before I'd met Richard. "For emergencies only," Dad had said with characteristic gravitas. "The kind of emergencies you pray never happen." I broke the seal now, 15 years later, understanding that this was precisely the kind of emergency my father had anticipated. The first document detailed the offshore trust established in my name in the Cayman Islands when I was still in graduate school. A trust that had grown to just over $40 million. A trust that remained completely separate from all marital assets. A trust that Richard had no knowledge of because my father, with his pathological distrust of anyone outside the family, had insisted on a clause in our prenuptial agreement that allowed for undisclosed family assets to remain separate property. At the time, I'd thought it unnecessarily secretive, even paranoid. Richard and I were in love. We were building an empire together, combining his technological brilliance with my financial acumen. What need did I have for hidden assets? Now, as I stared at the bank statements showing our emptied accounts, I silently thanked my father's prescience. I tucked the trust documents into my Hermes bag, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection, back straight, chin up, expression unreadable. My grandmother's sapphires glinted in the light. Richard had no idea what was coming. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I met Richard Blackwell at an investors' conference in San Francisco 15 years ago. I was 28, fresh out of Wharton with an MBA and working for my father's venture capital firm, Chen Global Investments. Richard was 32, a brilliant physicist who had just secured his first round of serious funding for his quantum computing startup. He stood out among the sea of entrepreneurs, not just for his penetrating intelligence, but for the clarity of his vision. While others pitched nebulous concepts with extravagant promises, Richard spoke with precision about the transformative potential of quantum technology. The problem with traditional computing, he'd explained during his presentation, isn't just its limitations. It's that we've accepted those limitations as immutable reality. That philosophy resonated with me, the refusal to accept conventional boundaries. I'd spent my life pushing against expectations, as the daughter of Chinese immigrants who'd built a financial empire, as a woman in the overwhelmingly male world of venture capital, as someone determined to succeed on her own merits, rather than her family name. After his presentation, I approached him with questions that most investors weren't asking. Not about market projections or exit strategies, but about the scientific principles underlying his work. He looked surprised, then pleased. "Most people just want to know when they'll get their money back," he said, smiling. "You actually want to understand the technology." Our conversation continued over dinner, then drinks, then breakfast the next morning. We talked about quantum entanglement, financial market inefficiencies, Chinese poetry, and Portuguese architecture. By the time I boarded my flight back to New York, I knew two things with certainty. I would recommend that Chen Global Investments fund Blackwell Quantum Technologies, and Richard Blackwell was unlike anyone I'd ever met. Our relationship developed alongside his company. My father, with his characteristic caution, agreed to a modest initial investment of $5 million in exchange for a 7% stake. When Richard delivered results ahead of schedule, we increased our position. 2 years later, when we married in a small ceremony at my family's estate in the Berkshires, Chen Global Investments owned 15% of BQT, and the company was valued at $120 million. "You found a good man," my father said at our wedding reception in a rare moment of approval. "Smart, hard-working." He paused, then added with a sly smile, "But never forget, in business and in marriage, always keep something in reserve." At the time, I'd attributed his comment to the traditional Chinese emphasis on financial prudence. Only later would I understand its deeper significance. The first 5 years of our marriage were a whirlwind of growth, both personal and professional. Richard's company expanded from a team of 7 to over 200 employees, with offices in New York, Silicon Valley, and Tokyo. I left my father's firm to establish my own investment consultancy, specializing in emerging technologies and sustainable energy. We worked constantly, often in parallel at our dining room table until dawn, fueled by passion for our respective fields and mutual admiration. "We're building something that will outlast us," Richard would say, his eyes alight with possibility. "Something that matters." I believed him completely. When Richard turned 40, BQT secured a government contract worth $1.8 billion for quantum encryption technology. We celebrated by purchasing the penthouse on Central Park and a beach house in the Hamptons. We donated $10 million to establish a quantum computing research center at MIT. We talked about having children, something we'd postponed while building our careers. "Now we have the foundation," Richard said, holding me close as we watched fireworks over the Manhattan skyline on New Year's Eve. "We can build the rest of our lives." 6 months later, I noticed the first subtle changes in his behavior. Canceled dinner plans. Weekends suddenly consumed by emergency meetings. A new distraction. In his eyes when I spoke, I attributed it to the pressures of the government contract, the responsibility of managing a company now valued at over $4 billion. Then came the business trips. Tokyo, where BQT had an established office. Then London, where we were considering expansion. Then Singapore, Dubai, São Paulo, cities where we had no current business interests but enormous potential, according to Richard. I didn't suspect infidelity. Richard had always been singularly focused, almost monastic in his dedication to his work. Besides, we still shared moments of genuine connection. Intellectual sparring over breakfast, comfortable silences while working side by side, the familiar rhythm of our intimacy. What I did notice was a new secrecy surrounding the company finances. Richard, who had always been transparent about BQT's operations, began to deflect my questions about certain expenditures. The quarterly reports sent to investors became more opaque, filled with technical jargon that obscured rather than clarified the company's position. "It's the nature of government contracts," he explained when I pressed him. "There are security considerations, confidentiality agreements. I can't share everything, even with you." I might have accepted this explanation indefinitely if not for my father's unexpected death 8 months ago. At 72, he suffered a massive stroke while swimming his daily laps. In his typical fashion, he'd left everything in meticulous order: his personal affairs, the company, his estate. As his only child, I inherited control of Chen Global Investments and its 15% stake in BQT, along with his personal fortune. The day after his funeral, his longtime attorney delivered a letter my father had written to be opened upon his death. "Alexandra," it began. If you're reading this, I am gone, and you must now rely entirely on your own judgment. Trust it. It has always been sound. But verify everything, especially where your husband's company is concerned. I've had my doubts about some of BQT's recent financial maneuvers. Nothing concrete enough to warrant confrontation, but enough to make me uneasy. Remember what I've always taught you. Love with your heart, but invest with your head. I'd set the letter aside at the time, overwhelmed by grief and the sudden responsibility of leading Chen Global Investments. Now, as I drove to Sophia's office with evidence of Richard's financial betrayal, my father's warning echoed in my mind with prophetic clarity. Sophia Zhang's office occupied the entire 48th floor of a sleek glass tower in Midtown. The reception area exudes quiet power, minimalist furnishings, museum-quality Chinese art, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I'd always appreciated how Sophia balanced her Chinese heritage with contemporary American business sensibilities, creating a space that was both familiar and formidable. Alexandra, she greeted me, emerging from her office. At 58, Sophia commanded attention. Impeccably tailored suit, silver-streaked black hair pulled into a precise chignon, eyes that missed nothing. She'd been my father's attorney for 30 years before becoming mine. Let's talk privately. I followed her past the curious eyes of junior associates into her corner office. Without preamble, I placed my laptop on her desk and opened the banking records I'd compiled. These are our personal and joint accounts, I explained, scrolling through the statements. Over the past 8 weeks, Richard has systematically withdrawn nearly $2.7 million. No discussion, no explanation. Sophia studied the screen, her expression neutral. Any unusual activity before this 8-week period? Nothing significant. Occasional large withdrawals, but always with my knowledge. Property purchases, investments, charitable donations. And the company? She asked, looking up sharply. BQT Financials? That's where it gets complicated. I pulled up additional files, the increasingly opaque quarterly reports, emails between Richard and the CFO that I'd accessed using my credentials. As a major investor, fragments of information that, taken individually, seemed innocuous enough. Since securing the government contract, Richard has restructured financial reporting. As majority shareholder and CEO, he has considerable latitude. Sophia's frown deepened as she examined the documents. Your father had concerns about this. Did he ever share them with you directly? Only in the letter after his death. I handed her a copy, which she read quickly. Typical James, cryptic but prescient. She set the letter aside. We need to investigate this systematically. First, we need to trace where the $2.7 million went. Multiple accounts, I replied. I've identified some, but I believe they're just waypoints. Sophia nodded, then pressed her intercom. Send in Marcus, please. Moments later, a young man in his 30s entered, broad-shouldered with keen eyes and a precise manner. Marcus Lee, Sophia introduced him, our forensic financial investigator, Georgetown Law and MIT Computer Science. He specializes in following digital money trails, Marcus nodded respectfully. Ms. Chen, Marcus, Alexandra needs complete financial intelligence, both personal accounts and corporate structures, priority and discretion. He absorbed this without visible reaction. Timeline? Yesterday, I answered. I'll need access credentials and any starting points you have. I handed him a flash drive. Everything I've found so far, including account numbers where Richard sent the funds. As Marcus left to begin his work, Sophia turned back to me. Now for the trust. Show me. I removed the trust documents from my bag and spread them across her desk. The Cayman Islands Trust had been established when I was 25, structured, with multiple layers of protection and privacy that only someone with my father's paranoid financial instincts would consider necessary. Initially funded with $10 million, it had grown to over $40 million through careful management and strategic investments. According to its terms, it would remain separate from all marital assets, regardless of jurisdiction or circumstances. Your father was thorough, Sophia remarked, examining the provisions. This is completely insulated from any claims Richard might make, even if he somehow discovered its existence. There's more, I said, revealing the final document. A secondary trust was established 6 months ago, just before my father's death. It contains intellectual property rights to key BQT patents that my father's original investment helped fund, which gave him certain rights according to the initial agreements. Sophia's eyebrows rose fractionally, the equivalent of astonishment from someone with her professional reserve. Does Richard know about this? No. My father transferred the rights quietly, using provisions in the original investment agreement. The patents themselves remain with BQT for use, but the underlying ownership was transferred to this trust in your name. Clever, Sophia murmured. If BQT ever tried to sell or transfer these patents without proper authorization, it would trigger immediate legal challenges and potential injunctions, I finished. My father didn't trust Richard's recent direction with the company. This was his insurance policy. Our conversation was interrupted by Sophia's assistant, Ms. Zhang. Mr. Li requests your presence in the conference room. He says it's urgent. We found Marcus surrounded by 3 monitors, lines of code and financial data flowing across the screens. He looked up as we entered, his expression grim. I've traced the initial transfers, he reported without preamble. The money moved through 4 separate institutions before landing in a holding company called Quantum Future LLC, registered in Nevada 3 months ago. And who owns Quantum Future? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. On paper, it's owned by another shell company based in the Seychelles, but I found incorporation documents listing Elise Vaughn as the managing director. The name meant nothing to me. Who is she? Marcus clicked through several screens, then turned one monitor toward us. A photograph appeared, a striking woman, with auburn hair and calculating eyes, perhaps 35. Dr. Elise Vaughn, quantum physicist, formerly with DARPA, currently listed as a strategic consultant to BQT on their government contract. The Mistress, Sophia stated flatly. It appears so, Marcus confirmed. But there's more. Quantum Future isn't just a receptacle for your personal funds. It's been receiving significant transfers from BQT corporate accounts as well, approximately $18 million over the past 5 months, disguised as consulting fees and research subsidies. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just marital infidelity. This was corporate embezzlement on a massive scale. There's something else, Marcus added, his voice tightening. Dr. Vaughn has been making regular trips to Shanghai over the past year. Given the nature of BQT's government contract, he didn't need to finish the thought. Quantum encryption technology with military applications, Chinese interest, a mistress with access to both proprietary technology and substantial funds. The pattern suggested something far more damaging than a simple affair. We need to approach this carefully, Sophia warned. If there are national security implications— First, we secure my position, I interrupted, my mind racing ahead. Chen Global Investment still owns 15% of BQT. Combined with the patent trust and other minority shareholders who would align with me, I can force an emergency board meeting. Sophia nodded slowly. What are you thinking, Alexandra? Met her gaze steadily. I'm thinking it's time to activate the Offshore Trust, not just to protect my assets, but to take control of BQT before Richard can do any more damage. As I spoke the words, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. This was no longer just about my husband's betrayal. It was about protecting everything my father had built, everything I had helped create. And perhaps, though I couldn't fully acknowledge it yet, about preventing a security breach that went far beyond our marriage or finances. Make the calls, I told Sophia. We move tomorrow. I didn't go home that night. Sophia arranged a suite at the Mandarin Oriental, A deliberate choice, as Richard would never think to look for me there. It was the hotel where we'd spent our first anniversary, and he'd complained incessantly about the excessive cost, despite our comfortable financial position at the time. A waste of resources, he'd called it. The irony wasn't lost on me as I settled into the luxurious space, my temporary command center for what was to come. At 7:15 the next morning, Marcus arrived with 3 assistants and additional equipment. They transformed the suite's dining room into a war room, multiple screens, secure communications, real-time financial monitoring systems. By 8:30, they had mapped the complete money trail from our personal accounts to Quantum Future LLC, and from there to various investments and properties. Most of your personal funds were used to purchase this, Marcus explained, bringing up images of a sleek modern home in the Malibu Hills. $6.2 million, purchased 3 months ago through a shell company. The deed lists Elise Vaughn as the beneficial owner. Our retirement money, I said quietly, funding their love nest. Marcus nodded grimly, then continued. The corporate funds followed a more complex path. He displayed a diagram showing money flowing through a dozen entities before consolidating in an account in the Cayman Islands. Not my trust, but one with striking structural similarities. It appears Dr. Vaughn used your family's trust as a template, Sophia observed. Likely after Richard shared details of your financial arrangements. The betrayal deepened with each revelation. Not only had Richard stolen our money, but he'd also weaponized my family's financial structures against me. There's more, Marcus said, his expression growing more troubled. We found this in Dr. Vaughn's email communications. He displayed an email chain between Elise and someone identified only as JL. The messages contained technical discussions about quantum encryption protocols, sprinkled with phrases like hardware specifications and implementation timeline. This could be legitimate work related to BQT's government contract, Marcus acknowledged, except for 2 things. First, these communications are happening on a private email server, not BQT's secure systems. Second, JL's IP address traces back to Shanghai. The room fell silent as we absorbed the implications. Corporate espionage, Sophia finally said. Possibly worse, Marcus nodded. Given the nature of BQT's government contracts, this could constitute a serious breach of national security protocols. We need concrete proof, I insisted. Speculation won't be enough to convince the board or authorities. I might have that, said a new voice from the doorway. We turned to find David Kim, BQT's chief security officer, standing there with Sophia's assistant. David had been with the company since nearly the beginning, one of Richard's first hires and one of the few executives I trusted implicitly. He'd always maintained a professional distance from Richard, reporting directly to the board on security matters rather than through the standard chain of command. Ms. Zhang's office contacted me yesterday, he explained, stepping into the room. I've had concerns for some time. What kind of concerns? I asked. David placed a thumb drive on the table. Last month, our monitoring systems detected unauthorized access to restricted research databases, access that came from Dr. Vaughn's credentials but at unusual hours. When I raised this with Richard, he dismissed it as a system error and instructed me to remove those alerts from our security protocols. And did you? Sophia asked sharply. A small smile crossed David's normally stoic face. Officially, yes. Unofficially, I created a shadow monitoring system. What I found disturbed me enough that I began my own investigation. He plugged in the drive and brought up a series of files. These are access logs showing Dr. Vaughn retrieving classified technical specifications at 3 a.m., then transmitting compressed data packages to external servers within minutes. The transmission destinations were masked, but with some effort, I traced them to locations in Shanghai and Beijing. I felt physically ill. My husband is selling military secrets to China. Not directly, David clarified. Based on the evidence, I believe Dr. Vaughn is the primary actor. Richard appears to be facilitating her access, whether knowingly or as an unwitting accomplice remains unclear. Does it matter? Marcus asked bluntly. Either way, it's treason. It matters for how we proceed, Sophia interjected. Alexandra's priority must be protecting herself and securing the company. If Richard is a willing participant in espionage, we need one approach. If he's being manipulated, we need another. I stared at the evidence displayed across the screens: financial trails, property records, security logs, email chains. The pieces formed a devastating mosaic of betrayal on multiple levels. My husband had not only emptied our accounts to fund a life with his mistress, but had potentially compromised national security in the process. There's one more thing you should see, David said quietly, pulling up a final document. This was in a hidden folder on the BQT secure server, accessible only to Richard and the CFO. The document appeared to be a draft of a corporate restructuring plan. As I scanned it, my breath caught. It outlined a strategy to dilute existing shareholders through a complex series of transactions, effectively reducing Chen Global Investments' stake from 15% to less than 3%. My control of my father's company, of our family's legacy, would be virtually eliminated. When was this created? I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. First draft, 3 months ago, David replied. The most recent revision was made yesterday. Yesterday, while I was discovering the drained accounts, while Richard was assuring me via text that he was in meetings all day. He had been actively planning to strip me of my company stake even as he drained our personal finances. I stood up, smoothing my skirt with deliberate calm. We have what we need. Sophia, contact the board members for an emergency meeting. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. David, secure copies of everything, then return to BQT and continue as normal. Marcus, prepare a complete financial presentation. For the board. And Richard? Sophia asked. He'll be suspicious of a sudden board meeting. Leave Richard to me, I replied. It's time I had a conversation with my husband. As everyone dispersed to their tasks, I stood at the window overlooking Central Park, my reflection superimposed over the autumn landscape. The woman looking back at me was transformed. No longer just a devoted wife or savvy investor, but a warrior preparing for battle. My grandmother's sapphire earrings caught the morning light, reminding me of generations of Chen women who had endured their own battles with dignity and strategic brilliance. I realized with startling clarity that the offshore millions my father had insisted I maintain weren't just financial assets, they were freedom. The power to choose my own path forward without compromise or concession. Richard had emptied our accounts, believing he was stripping me of resources and options. Instead, he had merely revealed the full extent of my strength. Ms. Chen, Marcus, interrupted my thoughts. The market opens in 20 minutes. If you're planning to make any moves with your offshore funds, now would be the time. I nodded, turning from the window with newfound resolve. Execute Plan A. Transfer $20 million from the Cayman Trust to the Acquisition Holding Company. Begin buying BQT shares on the open market, quietly, through the separate brokerages we discussed. $20 million will get you approximately 4% of outstanding shares at current market rates, he calculated quickly. Combined with Chen Global Investments' 15% and the proxy agreements Sophia secured overnight, that puts us at 26%, I replied. More than enough to force a vote on Richard's removal. The gears were now in motion. By this time tomorrow, Richard would understand exactly what it meant to underestimate Alexandra Chen. My phone rang as Marcus executed the stock purchase orders. Richard. Alexandra? His voice carried a practiced, casual tone that now sounded hollow to my ears. I just got out of meetings. Did you call earlier about some account issue? I muted the audio feed from my end so he couldn't hear the activity in the room, then switched to speaker mode so everyone could listen. Yes, I replied, matching his casual tone. There seems to be some unusual activity in our joint investment account. Nearly $250,000 transferred out yesterday. Ah, that. A slight hesitation. The Morrison deal. I mentioned it last month. That real estate opportunity in Seattle? The investment window opened suddenly, and I had to move quickly. Should provide excellent returns. The lie flowed effortlessly. There was no Morrison deal, no Seattle real estate opportunity. The money had gone directly to Quantum Future LLC. I see, I said, injecting mild confusion into my voice. I don't remember that discussion, but I've been distracted with taking over Chen Global. Speaking of which, I'd like your input on some company matters. Dinner tonight? Another hesitation. Tonight's tight. I have to finish the presentation for the DoD meeting tomorrow. Perfect. I'll come to your office. We can work late together, like we used to. I deliberately referenced our early days, when we'd frequently worked side by side into the night. I'll bring dinner from that Thai place you like. 7 o'clock? Well, sure, Richard acquiesced, unable to find a plausible reason to refuse. 7 works. After we hung up, Sophia raised an eyebrow. A confrontation at BQT headquarters seems risky. Not confrontation, I clarified. Reconnaissance. I need to see what he's doing in that office, and I need to assess whether he suspects anything. The board meeting is less than 24 hours away, and I want to look him in the eye before I make my final decision about how to proceed. What final decision? Marcus asked, glancing up from his monitors. I exchanged a look with Sophia, who nodded almost imperceptibly. She understood what I was considering. Whether to involve federal authorities immediately regarding the potential espionage, or to handle this more privately, I explained. My priority is protecting the company and its legitimate work. How we address Richard's betrayal depends partly on his current state of mind. You should have security, David insisted. If Richard suspects anything, he won't harm me, I said with certainty. That would undermine the narrative he's constructing. Remember, according to that corporate restructuring plan, he intends to ease me out gradually, preserving appearances while systematically reducing my influence. Violence would disrupt that strategy. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the cold calculation in my assessment. I wasn't speaking from emotional trust in my husband's character. I was analyzing his likely behavior based on his strategic objectives. It felt strange to view my marriage through such a lens, but each revelation had further distanced me from any emotional attachment to Richard Blackwell. Besides, I added, I won't be entirely unprotected. I turned to David. I assume BQT's security systems record all access and activities? Yes, he confirmed. Every door entry, elevator use, and computer login is logged. The executive offices have additional monitoring, ostensibly for security purposes. Perfect. I need you monitoring those feeds tonight. If anything seems concerning, Sophia has a team ready to intervene. With that settled, we turned to finalizing our strategy for the board meeting. Sophia had already secured verbal commitments from 4 of the 7 non-executive board members, who collectively represented various investor groups. Combined with my own shares and newly acquired stake, we had the votes needed to remove Richard. What about the DoD contract? Marcus asked, raising a crucial concern. If Richard is removed and there are federal investigations into potential espionage, the government could pull the contract entirely. I've thought of that, I replied. David, who at BQT besides Richard has complete knowledge of the contract deliverables? Dr. Lin Wei, he answered without hesitation. She's the technical lead who developed most of the core encryption protocols. Richard has been gradually sidelining her over the past 6 months as Elise Vaughn gained influence, but Lin still understands the technology better than anyone. Is she trustworthy? Absolutely. She's expressed concerns about some of Elise's technical modifications, concerns that Richard dismissed. Lin has been with BQT since nearly the beginning and holds several of the key patents. The same parents my father secured in that secondary trust, I noted, pieces clicking into place. Contact her, discreetly. Tell her I need to meet privately, before the board meeting tomorrow. As David stepped away to make the arrangements, Sophia pulled up the legal documentation we'd need for the board meeting. We should discuss severance terms. Severance? I laughed incredulously. After what he's done? Strategic severance, Sophia clarified. Terms designed not for Richard's benefit, but to protect the company and recover assets. We offer a minimally acceptable package contingent on full cooperation, return of misappropriated funds, and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. And if he refuses, then we proceed with criminal charges, civil litigation, and asset freezes. Sophia's expression was impassive. The severance isn't generosity, Alexandra. It's calculated efficiency. I nodded, understanding her reasoning. A prolonged legal battle would damage BQT's reputation, potentially jeopardizing the government, contract, and shareholder value. A clean break, even one that allowed Richard to retain some dignity and resources, might better serve the company's interests, provided we recovered the bulk of the stolen funds. Draft both scenarios, I instructed. But make the severance painful enough that he feels it. I want our personal assets returned in full, his stake in BQT transferred to company ownership, and comprehensive cooperation with any security review. As the team continued preparations, I stepped into the bedroom of the suite to prepare for my evening with Richard. I selected a cream silk blouse and charcoal skirt, professional but approachable. Not the armor of confrontation, but the camouflage of normalcy. My phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Meeting confirmed. 7 a.m. tomorrow. Secure location. LWW Dr. Lin Wei had agreed to meet. Another piece in place. At 6:30, as I prepared to leave for BQT headquarters, Marcus approached with a small device. A precaution, he explained, handing me what appeared to be an ordinary compact mirror. Audio recording with encrypted cloud backup. If Richard says anything incriminating, we'll have it documented. I slipped the device into my purse alongside my regular compact, a seemingly redundant item that would escape notice even if Richard happened to look through my belongings. The stock purchases are complete, Marcus added. 4.2%, acquired through 6 different brokerages. No single transaction large enough to trigger reporting requirements. And Richard? Still at the office. No unusual communications detected. He appears to be working on financial projections. Likely, preparing to explain any discrepancies you might have noticed. I nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over me. In less than 24 hours, everything would change. My marriage would officially end. Richard would face consequences for his betrayal. BQT would enter a new phase under different leadership. One last thing, Sophia said as I reached the door. Remember why you're going tonight. Information gathering only. Don't reveal what we know, no matter how tempting it might be to confront him. Don't worry, I replied, slipping on my coat. I learned negotiation from my father. Never show your full hand until the final round. As the elevator descended to the lobby, I found myself thinking not of Richard or the coming confrontation, but of my father. Had he somehow anticipated this moment when he established those offshore trusts? Had his insistence on financial independence been not just cultural prudence, but a specific shield against the very betrayal I now faced? Whatever his reasoning, I silently thanked him as I stepped into the waiting car. Richard had emptied our accounts for his mistress, believing he was leaving me vulnerable and dependent. Instead, he was about to discover exactly what I was capable of when pushed to my limits. The BQT headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming skyscraper. In Midtown, its logo, a stylized quantum bit, illuminated against the darkening October sky. As my car pulled up to the entrance, I felt a curious detachment, as if I were arriving at a business meeting rather than confronting the ruins of my marriage. In a way, That's exactly what it was. I texted David to confirm my arrival, then entered the lobby, Thai food in hand, a prop in this carefully choreographed performance. The security guard nodded in recognition as I badged through. Richard hadn't revoked my access, another sign he believed his deception remained undiscovered. "Good evening, Mrs. Blackwell," the elevator attendant greeted me. "Working late tonight?" "Yes, Frank," I replied with a practiced smile. "Earnings. Season never sleeps." The familiar ping announced the executive floor. As I stepped out, I activated the recording device in my purse with a subtle press through the fabric. From here on, everything would be documented. Richard's office door was open, blue light from his computer screen casting shadows across his face as he frowned at financial spreadsheets. He looked up at my approach, his expression shifting from concentration to a carefully composed smile. "Alexandra," he said, standing to greet me. "This is a nice surprise." I allowed him to kiss my cheek, suppressing the revulsion that threatened to surface. Up close, I could smell unfamiliar perfume lingering faintly on his collar, Elise's signature, scent marking her territory. "I brought your favorite," I said, holding up the bag of food. "Green curry and those spring rolls you like." "You're too good to me," he replied, clearing space on his desk for the containers. The irony of his statement hung in the air between us, though only I recognized it. For a moment, I studied him. This man I'd loved for 15 years, the brilliant physicist I'd helped build into a corporate titan. Has any of it been real? Had he always been calculating my utility to his ambitions, waiting for the moment when discarding me became advantageous? "So," I began casually, unpacking the food, "tell me about this Morrison deal. I'm surprised I don't remember discussing it." Richard didn't miss a beat. "It came through Adam's network. You remember Adam Sutton from Stanford? He's been developing mixed-use properties in emerging tech corridors. This one's a perfect fit for our portfolio, prime Seattle location, pre-leased to 3 Fortune 500 companies." The lies flowed smoothly, embellished with just enough specific details to sound plausible. In another life, Richard might have made an excellent con man. "Sounds promising," I murmured, taking a bite of my food. "When can I see the prospectus?" A flicker of hesitation. "It's still being finalized. Adam's team is preparing the full documentation. Should have it next week." "And the $250,000 was what exactly?" "Earnest money," he replied promptly. "Secures our position while the formal paperwork is prepared." I nodded as if accepting this explanation, then deliberately changed the subject. "How are the DoD preparations coming? You mentioned a presentation tomorrow?" Richard relaxed visibly, moving on to safer ground. "Just finalizing some technical specifications. The Pentagon has additional security requirements for the quantum key distribution protocol." "Working with Elise Vaughn on that?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational. "Among others," he replied vaguely. "She's been instrumental in adapting our technology to their needs." "I'm sure she has," I said, allowing just a hint of dryness to enter my voice. "David Kim mentioned some security protocol adjustments recently. Something about access permissions?" Richard's chopsticks paused halfway to his mouth, then continued, "Their journey." If I hadn't been watching closely, I might have missed that moment of tension. "Minor system updates," he said dismissively. "David tends to be overcautious. It's a good quality in a security officer, but sometimes efficiency requires flexibility. Especially when working with external consultants," I agreed pleasantly. "Speaking of which, I noticed some significant consulting fees in the last quarterly report. 10 million for specialized technical services? That's quite an increase from previous quarters." Richard set down his chopsticks, his expression sharpening. "You've been reviewing the quarterlies?" "Of course," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Chen Global still owns 15% of BQT. My father may be gone, But our family's investment deserves proper oversight. I thought you trusted me to handle the operational details, he said, his tone light but eyes watchful. Trust, but verify, I countered with a small smile. A lesson from my father I've come to appreciate more since his death. A subtle current of tension now flowed beneath our seemingly mundane conversation. Richard was recalculating, trying to determine exactly what I knew or suspected. The consulting fees are for specialized expertise related to the DoD contract, he finally explained. Some of it is classified, hence the general description in public filings. I see. I took a sip of water. And does the board have visibility into these arrangements? The executive committee has approved all expenditures, he replied carefully. The executive committee consisted of Richard, the CFO, and one board member, all firmly in Richard's camp. I nodded thoughtfully, then extracted a folder from my bag. While we're discussing company business, I wanted your input on these Chen Global matters. My team has identified some potential synergies between our AI investments and BQT's quantum computing work. As Richard reviewed the documents, legitimate Chen Global business that served as my pretext for this meeting, I used the opportunity to glance around his office. The space was meticulously organized, with 2 computer monitors, various awards and credentials displayed on the walls, and a single framed photo of us from 5 years ago, summiting Mount Kilimanjaro. I noticed the absence of more recent personal photos, a subtle but telling detail. His desk held the usual executive accoutrements: expensive pen set, my gift for his 40th birthday, leather portfolio, smartphone face down beside his keyboard. Nothing overly suspicious. These look promising, Richard said, returning the folder. Especially the machine learning applications. Have your team coordinate with our R&D department to explore further. I smiled. Actually, I was thinking we could discuss it directly with Dr. Lin Wei. Her quantum algorithm work seems particularly relevant to these neural network models. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lin's been reassigned to legacy systems. Dr. Vaughn leads our advanced applications research now. Really? When did that happen? I asked, feigning surprise. Lin was pioneering that field. Recent reorganization, he said dismissively. Elise brings fresh perspective and valuable connections. I'm sure she does, I thought bitterly, though my expression remained neutral. I'd still like to speak with Lin, for continuity's sake. I'll see if she's available, Richard replied non-committally, then checked his watch. I should get back to the DoD presentation. Was there anything else you needed to discuss? Just one thing, I said, gathering my belongings. I was thinking of attending the board meeting tomorrow. As Chen Global's representative, Richard froze momentarily, then recovered. Tomorrow's meeting is just routine updates. Nothing that requires your personal attention. Nevertheless, I replied, standing to leave. I think it's time I took a more active role in monitoring our investment. After all, BQT represents a significant portion of Chen Global's portfolio. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course. It's always good to have you involved. At the door, I turned back. Oh, one last question. I noticed some unusual activity in our personal accounts as well, beyond the Morrison investment. Nearly $3 million withdrawn over the past 2 months? Richard's expression remained carefully composed. Portfolio rebalancing. The market's been volatile. I've moved some assets to more stable positions temporarily. I see, I said softly. And you'll be providing the details of these new positions? Of course, he replied smoothly. I've been meaning to update you. Things have been hectic with the DoD contract. I smiled one last time. No rush. I'm sure everything will become clear very soon. As I walked away, I heard him make a phone call, his voice too low to distinguish the words. I didn't need to hear them to know he was contacting Elise Vaughn, warning her that I was asking questions. In the elevator, I sent a text to Sophia. Phase 1 complete. He suspects something but doesn't know what. Proceed with Phase 2. The elevator. Doors opened to the lobby, and I emerged transformed. The reconnaissance was complete. The time for pretense was over. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation we'd so carefully prepared for, the moment when Richard would discover the true cost of underestimating Alexandra Chen. Met Dr. Lin Wei at 7 the next morning in a private room at the New York Public Library, neutral ground where we wouldn't be observed by anyone from BQT. She arrived precisely on time, a slender woman in her early 40s with intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses and an aura of contained energy. "Mrs. Blackwell," she greeted me formally, then hesitated. "Or should I say Ms. Chen? David mentioned you might prefer your family name under the circumstances." "Alexandra is fine," I replied, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for meeting me, especially with such limited context." Lynn nodded, her expression guarded. David indicated it concerned BQT's future and potentially the security of our work. That was enough. I studied her briefly. Lynn had been with the company for 11 years, joining shortly after completing her PhD at MIT. Her brilliance had helped establish BQT as a leader in quantum encryption. Yet Richard had systematically sidelined her in recent months. "What I'm about to share is highly sensitive," I began. "Before I continue, I need to know, where do your loyalties lie? With BQT as an institution, or with Richard personally?" She didn't hesitate. "My loyalty is to the work, the science, the integrity of what we've built." Her eyes flashed with sudden intensity. "Which is why I've been increasingly concerned about recent developments, such as protocol modifications that compromise security rather than enhance it, unexplained access to restricted databases, the systematic removal of redundant verification systems." She leaned forward, "and Dr. Vaughn's growing influence over both technical decisions and Richard himself." I nodded, then laid out everything we'd discovered: the embezzled funds, Elise's connections to Chinese interests, the unauthorized technology transfers, and Richard's plans to dilute existing shareholders. Lynn listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled. When I finished, she was silent for several moments. "I suspected impropriety," she finally said. "But not at this scale, and certainly not espionage." She removed her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose. "The DoD encryption protocol, the modifications Elise insisted upon, creates a subtle backdoor. I flagged this in my technical assessment, but Richard dismissed my concerns and removed me from the project." "Do you have documentation of your original assessment?" "Of course." Lynn's professional pride was evident. "I maintain meticulous records of all my work, stored on secure offline servers that Richard doesn't know about." "Would you be willing to present this information to the board this morning? Your technical credibility would be invaluable in explaining the significance of these compromises." Lynn hesitated only briefly. "Yes. BQT's work is too important to be corrupted this way." She met my gaze directly. "What's your plan for the company after Richard is removed?" "Stabilization first," I replied. "Then reassessment of all projects, especially the DoD contract. I'll need a trusted technical lead to oversee that process." A small smile touched Lynn's lips. "I'd be interested in that role." "Good." I checked my watch. "The board meeting begins in 1 hour. Let's proceed." We arrived at BQT headquarters separately. I entered through the main lobby, making no effort to conceal my presence. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly as I approached. Clearly, she hadn't expected to see me this morning. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwell," she said, recovering quickly. "The board meeting is in the main conference room. They're just gathering now." "Thank you, Jennifer," I replied pleasantly, as if this were any normal day. In the elevator, I received confirmation texts from our team. Marcus had the financial presentation ready, David had secured all electronic evidence, Sophia had the legal documents prepared, and Lynn had arrived through a secondary entrance with her technical documentation. All pieces were in place. The executive floor hummed with subdued energy as I stepped off the elevator. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see board members settling into their seats, accepting coffee from assistants, reviewing materials. Richard stood at the head of the table, engaged in conversation with the CFO, Jackson Williams. As I entered, conversation stuttered to a halt. Richard looked up, momentary surprise flickering across his face before he composed himself. "Alexandra," he greeted me, his tone carefully modulated. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us so early." "I said I'd be attending," I replied calmly, selecting a seat halfway down the table rather than my usual place beside Richard. An awkward silence fell as Richard assessed this subtle but visible shift in dynamics. Several board members exchanged glances, sensing tension but unsure of its source. Richard cleared his throat. "Well, since everyone's here, let's begin. First item on the agenda is the quarterly financial review. Jackson, if you'll—" "Actually," I interjected smoothly, "I'd like to propose a modification to today's agenda." Richard's smile froze. "The agenda was distributed last week, as per protocol." "Yes, but circumstances have changed." I turned to address the full board. As representative of Chen Global Investments, holder of 15% of BQT shares, I moved to amend the agenda to address urgent governance concerns, specifically, the immediate removal of Richard Blackwell as CEO on grounds of financial malfeasance and breach of fiduciary duty. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Richard's face was drained of color. "This is absurd," he managed, looking to the board chairman for support. "Philip, this ambush violates every governance protocol we have." Philip Harriman, the 70-year-old chairman who had guided BQT since its early days, raised a hand. For silence. Serious accusations require serious consideration. "Ms. Chen, I presume you have evidence to support these claims?" "Comprehensive evidence," I confirmed, nodding to Sophia, who had entered silently during the commotion. "My counsel has prepared complete documentation for the board's review." Richard's expression hardened as he recognized Sophia. "Whatever this is, it's a personal vendetta, not a legitimate corporate concern," he declared, turning to address the Kai. "Board. Alexandra and I have been experiencing some marital difficulties. She's using her corporate position to address the fact that you've embezzled over $18 million from BQT through fraudulent consulting contracts," I interrupted coldly. "Or perhaps to discuss how you've systematically drained our personal accounts of nearly $3 million to fund your relationship with Elise Vaughn, who, coincidentally, is the recipient of those fraudulent consulting fees." The room fell silent. Richard stared at me, calculation replacing shock as he realized the extent of my knowledge. "These are private matters that have no bearing on my leadership of BQT," he said finally, attempting to regain control. "Private matters?" I echoed, signaling Sophia to distribute the evidence packets to each board member. "Let's examine what's private and what's corporate. Please turn to page 3 of the materials before you." As the board members opened the packets, I continued. "What you're seeing is documentation of systematic fund transfers from BQT operating accounts to Quantum Future LLC, a shell company controlled by Dr. Elise Vaughn. Over $18 million diverted through fraudulent consulting contracts for services, never rendered. These are legitimate consulting arrangements for classified work related to the DoD contract," Richard countered quickly. "The executive committee approved all expenditures." "An executive committee consisting of yourself, your hand-picked CFO, and one board member who was not given complete information," I replied. "Now turn to page 7. The rustling of pages filled the room. Jackson Williams, the CFO, had grown increasingly pale as he reviewed the evidence. "These documents show that Dr. Vaughn has been making regular trips to Shanghai, where she met with individuals connected to Chinese intelligence services. During these same periods, Classified BQT technical specifications were transmitted to servers in China. A collective gasp rippled through the room. This was no longer just about corporate theft. It was about potential treason. "This is preposterous," Richard declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "These interpretations of Dr. Vaughn's activities are speculative at best, malicious at worst." "Perhaps Dr. Wei can clarify whether they're speculative," I suggested, as Lynn entered the room, carrying her own documentation. Richard's expression shifted from defensive to genuinely alarmed. "Lynn has no authority to—" "Dr. Wei will present technical evidence showing how Dr. Vaughn's modifications to the DoD encryption protocols created deliberate vulnerabilities, backdoors that would allow unauthorized access to supposedly secure communications," I continued, ignoring Richard's interruption. For the next 20 minutes, Lynn methodically walked the board through the technical details, explaining in terms they could understand how the modified protocols compromised national security. The evidence was devastating and irrefutable. As she concluded, Richard made one last desperate attempt. "This is clearly a coordinated attack on my leadership, driven by personal animus. I demand time to prepare a proper response to these accusations." Philip Harriman removed his glasses, his expression grave. "Richard, these are not merely accusations. They are documented facts presenting an immediate risk to both this company and potentially national security." He turned to address the full board. "Given the evidence presented, I move that we vote immediately on Ms. Chen's motion to remove Richard Blackwell as CEO of Blackwell Quantum Technologies, effective immediately, pending full investigation of these matters." One by one, the board members voted. Richard watched in mounting disbelief as his support crumbled, until the final tally stood at 8-1 for his immediate removal. Only his longtime friend Bradley Morrison, the same name he'd used in his fabricated investment story, had voted against. "This is my company," Richard said quietly, dangerously. "I built it from nothing." "We built it," I corrected him. "With my family's initial investment, with the brilliance of people like Dr. Wei, with the trust of clients and partners who believed in the integrity of our work." I stood, addressing the board. "As the representative of Chen Global Investments, I nominate Dr. Lin Wei as interim CEO while we conduct a full leadership search. Dr. Wei has the technical expertise to address the immediate concerns with the DoD contract and the institutional knowledge to stabilize operations during this transition." The vote was unanimous in favor. Richard remained frozen in place as security personnel entered the room, a precaution Sophia had arranged in advance. "You've just destroyed everything," he said, looking directly at me, voice low enough that only I could hear. "You have no idea what you've done." "No, Richard," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "You destroyed it when you betrayed every principle and relationship that built this company. I'm simply salvaging what remains." As security escorted him from the room, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a weary resolve to repair the damage he had caused. The confrontation was over. The reconstruction was about to begin. The hours following Richard's removal passed in a blur of activity. Sophia's team implemented the contingency plan we'd developed, securing company servers, revoking access credentials, freezing corporate accounts, and coordinating with building security to escort Richard from the premises. By noon, I stood in Richard's former office, now Lynn's, watching a technical team sweep for surveillance devices. The room felt different already, Richard's presence wiped away by the purposeful activity of people reclaiming the space for legitimate work. "We've frozen all accounts associated with Quantum Future LLC, Marcus reported, looking up from his laptop. "Unfortunately, approximately $6 million appears to have been moved offshore in the last 12 hours, after your dinner with Richard last night." I nodded, unsurprised. "He suspected something and took precautions, What about Elise Vaughn? No sign of her at her apartment or at BQT today. Her office has been secured and is being examined by David's team. Marcus hesitated, then added, her passport was used at JFK this morning, 6:15 a.m. flight to Paris. Running, Sophia observed from across the room. That's essentially an admission of guilt. Or self-preservation, I countered. Either way, it complicates our recovery efforts. The door opened and Lynn entered, looking remarkably composed despite being thrust into the CEO role just hours earlier. The DoD representatives are here, she announced. They were already scheduled to review the encryption protocol today. Given the circumstances, we need to tell them everything, I said firmly. Complete transparency is our only path forward. Lynn nodded in agreement. I've prepared a technical briefing outlining the compromised elements and our immediate remediation plan, but they'll have questions beyond the technical issues. I'll join you, I offered. As a major shareholder and board member, I should be part of this conversation. The Department of Defense team consisted of 3 individuals, 2 technical specialists, and a stern-looking woman who introduced herself simply as Ms. Winters, DoD Contracts. Their expressions remained impassive as Lynn methodically explained the situation, the unauthorized protocol modifications, the backdoor vulnerabilities, the connection to Chinese interests, and Richard's removal. In essence, Lynn concluded, we believe Dr. Vaughn was systematically compromising the encryption system while using her relationship with our former CEO to avoid scrutiny. Ms. Winters removed her glasses, fixing us with a penetrating stare. Let me be clear, this represents a catastrophic breach of both contractual obligations and potentially national security. Under normal circumstances, this would result in immediate contract termination and possible criminal investigations. I maintained eye contact, refusing to show anxiety. We understand the severity of the situation. That's precisely why we acted decisively once we uncovered the evidence. Uncovered? One of the technical specialists raised an eyebrow. It appears these vulnerabilities existed for months, while your company's leadership either failed to detect them or actively concealed them. Both assertions are correct, Lynn acknowledged, her scientific integrity evident in her refusal to minimize the failure. I identified concerns with Dr. Vaughn's modifications and reported them to Richard Blackwell. He dismissed those concerns and removed me from the project. Ms. Winters made a note. And you didn't report these concerns through alternative channels? In retrospect, I should have, Lynn admitted. But at the time, I had no concrete evidence of malicious intent, only technical reservations that could be explained as different design philosophies. I interjected carefully. What matters now is that we've identified the compromised systems, removed the responsible parties, and are prepared to implement immediate remediation under appropriate oversight. For the next 2 hours, the technical team grilled Lynn on every aspect of the encryption protocol, testing her knowledge and assessing the viability of her proposed fixes. Throughout, she demonstrated not just technical mastery, but an unwavering commitment to security integrity that seemed to gradually earn their respect. Finally, Ms. Winters closed her portfolio. We will need to report this situation up our chain of command. In the meantime, all work on the current protocol implementation is suspended. Dr. Wei, your team will provide our technical specialist with complete access to all relevant systems and documentation. Of course, Lynn agreed immediately. Ms. Chen, Ms. Winters continued, turning to me. As a major shareholder and board member, you should understand that BQT's future relationship with the Department of Defense hangs by the thinnest of threads. Only the evident value of your core technology and Dr. Wei's apparent integrity give you any chance of salvaging this contract. I nodded, accepting the gravity of her warning. We understand. Complete transparency and cooperation are our only priorities. After the DoD team departed, Lynn sank into her chair, exhaustion finally showing on her face. That was intensely unpleasant, but could have been much worse. They're giving us a chance, I agreed. Limited and conditional, but still a chance. The technical remediation is straightforward, Lynn observed. Rebuilding trust will be the greater challenge. My phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. Federal agents requesting meeting Revon espionage concerns. Your presence is requested ASAP. I showed the message to Lynn, who nodded grimly. I expected this. Go, I'll continue damage control. Here. The federal agents occupied a conference room 2 floors below. 3 men and 1 woman. Their government credentials identifying them as FBI counterintelligence specialists. Ms. Chen, the lead agent, began after introductions. We need to understand the full extent of Dr. Vaughn's activities and your husband's involvement. For the next hour, I provided a detailed chronology of events, sharing copies of the evidence we'd compiled. The agents took notes but revealed little about their own knowledge or intentions. Dr. Vaughn left the country this morning, the female agent noted. Do you believe your husband plans to join her? I don't know, I admitted. His access to BQT has been terminated, and we've frozen the accounts we know about, but he likely has contingency resources. When did you last speak with him? The lead agent asked. During the board meeting this morning briefly, as he was being escorted out. And what did he say? I recalled Richard's final words. You've just destroyed everything. You have no idea what you've done. The agents exchanged glances. That could be interpreted as a threat, one observed, or simply the bitter response of, a man whose schemes had collapsed, I countered, unwilling to paint Richard as more calculating than evidence warranted. As the agents prepared to leave, the lead agent paused. Ms. Chen, your cooperation is appreciated, but there's something you should understand. This case goes beyond corporate espionage or marital betrayal. The technologies potentially compromised have significant national security implications. I'm aware, I replied. Then you should also be aware that your husband may face serious federal charges, depending on what our investigation reveals about his knowledge and involvement. The reality of Richard potentially facing treason charges, a capital offense, hit me with unexpected force. Despite everything he had done, some part of me still remembered the brilliant, passionate man I had fallen in love with 15 years ago. I understand, I said quietly, and I will continue to cooperate fully with your investigation. After the agents departed, I found myself alone in the conference room, surrounded by the debris of meetings, empty coffee cups, discarded notepads, the lingering tension of difficult conversations. For the first time since discovering the drained accounts yesterday morning, was it really only yesterday? I allowed myself a moment of genuine emotional response. Not grief for my marriage, that had been dying by inches for months before I discovered Richard's betrayal. Not regretting exposing his crimes, the company and potentially national security had been at stake. Perhaps it was mourning for the future we had once envisioned together, now irrevocably lost. My phone interrupted this rare moment of reflection, a text from Marcus. Urgent development. Richard attempted to access offshore accounts in Singapore. Appears to be booking private aircraft. The moment of sentiment evaporated. Richard was running, just as Elise had. I texted back. Alert federal authorities with all details. Track everything. Then I called Sophia. Richard's trying to flee the country. We need to lock down every financial avenue immediately. Already in progress, she replied. But there's another development. The CFO, Jackson Williams, is cooperating. Says he has evidence Richard coerced his participation in the financial fraud by threatening to expose personal indiscretions. Does his evidence implicate Richard in the espionage angle as well? Unclear, but he's willing to testify about Richard's explicit knowledge of the funds going to Quantum Future and Elise. I considered this. Jackson had been Richard's ally for years, yet was now apparently scrambling to save himself by providing evidence against his former boss. It was both predictable and vaguely distasteful. Have his testimony properly documented, I instructed, but verify everything independently. Richard may have prepared Jackson as a contingency, someone who would offer limited admissions while concealing the full extent of their activities. As I ended the call, a notification appeared on my phone, an email from Richard sent to my personal account. The subject line read simply, "You don't understand what you've done." For a moment, I hesitated, finger hovering over the message. Then I forwarded it unopened to Sophia and the federal agents, adding, "Received just now. Have not opened." Whatever Richard wanted to say, threats, pleas, manipulations, would be assessed by legal and security professionals first. The days when his words could directly influence my emotions or decisions were over. I gathered my belongings and headed back to Lynn's office. The immediate crises were being managed, but the full consequences of Richard's betrayal were still unfolding. We had a company to stabilize, a government contract to salvage, and federal investigations to navigate. The offshore millions that had once represented my father's cautious financial planning had become a lifeline, not just for me personally, but for the company itself. Richard had emptied our accounts, believing he was leaving me vulnerable and dependent, never imagining I had resources he couldn't touch. His miscalculation would cost him everything. 3 days after Richard's removal, I stood at the window of my temporary office at BQT headquarters, watching the autumn rain transform Manhattan into a watercolor of blurred lights and reflections. So much had changed in such a short time, both personally and professionally. My marriage was over, my husband a fugitive under federal investigation, and I had transitioned from behind-the-scenes investor to active corporate leader. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Sophia entered, accompanied by a man I recognized as Special Agent Donovan from the FBI counterintelligence team. "Alexandra," Sophia began, her formal tone indicating the seriousness of the conversation to follow. "Agent Donovan has an update regarding Richard." I gestured for them to sit. "Have you located him?" "Yes," Donovan confirmed. "Your husband was detained in Singapore, attempting to board a private aircraft bound for an undisclosed location. Singaporean authorities are holding him pending extradition proceedings." A complex wave of emotions washed over me. Relief that Richard wouldn't escape consequences, concern about the international legal complications, and lingering disbelief that the man I'd built a life with had become a fugitive. "And Dr. Vaughn?" I asked. "Still at large," Donovan replied. "French authorities are cooperating, but we believe she's already left Paris. Given her connections, China remains the most likely destination." I nodded, unsurprised. "What happens next with Richard?" "Extradition from Singapore is relatively straightforward, but not immediate. In the meantime, we've been analyzing the evidence you provided along with materials seized from BQT and Richard's personal devices." Donovan paused, choosing his words carefully. "The picture emerging suggests your husband may have been more victim than perpetrator in the espionage aspect of this case." This caught me by surprise. "Explain." "Electronic communications between Dr. Vaughn and her Chinese contacts indicate she deliberately targeted BQT because of its DoD contracts. She cultivated a relationship with Richard specifically to gain access and influence. She seduced him. As part of an intelligence operation," I said flatly. "Essentially, yes," Donovan confirmed. "Though that doesn't excuse his complicity once the relationship began. He still facilitated her access and helped conceal her activities, whether he fully understood their purpose or not. And the financial fraud? The embezzlement from our personal accounts and the company? That appears more directly attributable to Mr. Blackwell," Donovan acknowledged. "Dr. Vaughn exploited his vulnerabilities, but the financial crimes were primarily his doing, likely to maintain her affections and the lifestyle she demanded." I absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the Richard I thought I knew. It painted a slightly different picture. Not an innocent man, certainly, but perhaps a weak one who had been deliberately targeted and manipulated. It didn't excuse his betrayal of our marriage or his theft, but it contextualized them. This may affect the charges he ultimately faces, Donovan explained. Espionage and treason are more difficult to prove if he was an unwitting or reluctant participant. The financial crimes, however, remain clear-cut. After Agent Donovan left, Sophia remained. "How are you processing this?" she asked with unusual gentleness. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "It doesn't change what he did to me, to us, but it suggests a more complicated narrative than simple greed or midlife crisis. People rarely betray their principles for a single reason," Sophia observed. Richard's vulnerabilities, his ego, his desire for admiration, his material aspirations, made him an ideal target for someone like Elise Vaughn. "A man who can be led by his weaknesses shouldn't be leading a company," I replied, more sharply than intended. Sophia didn't disagree. Regardless of his motivations, the immediate challenges remain the same. BQT needs stabilization, the government contracts require remediation, and your personal financial situation needs restructuring. She was right, of course. Understanding. Richard's psychology might provide some context, but it didn't change the practical realities we faced. "What's the status of the financial recovery?" I asked, refocusing on actionable matters. "Mixed," Sophia reported. "We've frozen approximately $4.2 million across various domestic accounts. Singapore authorities have secured another $1.8 million that Richard was carrying electronically. The Malibu property purchased for Elise has been identified for asset recovery proceedings." "And the offshore funds?" "More challenging. Approximately $9 million of the corporate embezzlement was transferred through multiple jurisdictions before. Reaching accounts we haven't yet identified. Recovery will require international legal cooperation, which takes time." I nodded, having expected as much. "And our personal accounts?" "About half of the $2.7 million has been traced and frozen. The remainder—" Sophia spread her hands in a gesture of uncertainty. "Gone with Elise," I finished. "Most likely." A familiar calm settled over me, the same clarity I'd felt when first discovering Richard's betrayal. "We focus on what we can control. The offshore trust has more than enough to ensure my financial stability, regardless of what we recover from Richard." "And BQT?" "That's the priority now," I confirmed. "Has Lynn provided an update on the DoD remediation?" Sophia checked her tablet. "The technical team has been working around the clock. They've identified all compromised protocols and developed replacement systems. Initial feedback from DoD technical specialists has been cautiously positive." "Good. Schedule a full board briefing for tomorrow. We need complete transparency with all stakeholders." As Sophia left to make arrangements, my phone chimed with a message from Lynn. "Technical remediation Phase 1 complete. DoD specialists verifying. Now. Permission to proceed with Phase 2? I replied immediately. "Approved. Keep me updated." Setting my phone aside, I turned back to the rain-streaked window, reflecting on the unexpected path my life had taken. A week ago, I had been Alexandra Blackwell, wife of a successful CEO, comfortable in my role as investor and advisor, trusting in the partnership I believed defined my marriage. Now I was Alexandra Chen again, reclaiming my family name along with my independence, directly involved in saving the company my family had helped build. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was fundamental. I had rediscovered parts of myself that had gradually been subsumed in my marriage to Richard. My decisiveness, my strategic thinking, my willingness to take bold action when necessary. My father had always insisted I maintain financial independence, even within my marriage. "Money isn't just currency," he'd told me once. "It's the freedom to make choices based on principle rather than necessity." His insistence on the offshore trust had seemed excessive, even paranoid, when Richard and I were building what I thought was an unshakable partnership. Now I recognize it as profound wisdom. Those offshore millions weren't just financial security. They represented the capacity to act with autonomy when a crisis struck. To make decisions based on integrity rather than vulnerability. A knock at the door interrupted my reflections. David Kim entered, carrying a secure tablet. "We've completed the sweep of all BQT systems," he reported. "The good news is that the actual damage appears more limited than we initially feared. The compromised protocols affected specific aspects of the DoD project but didn't extend to our core commercial encryption products." "That is good news," I agreed. "What about customer impact?" "Minimal, based on our assessment. The commercial systems use different architectural approaches than the custom DoD implementation. We're still conducting verification, but so far, all commercial deployments appear secure." I felt the first genuine relief in days. BQT's commercial business, the foundation of its market valuation and future growth, seemed to have escaped the damage caused by Richard's poor judgment. "There's something else," David added, handing me the tablet. "We found this in a hidden directory on Richard's personal server." The screen displayed what appeared to be a personal journal entry, dated just 3 months ago. "E continues to push for access to the Gamma protocols. Says it's essential for her contribution to the DoD implementation, but those specifications aren't relevant to her assigned modules." When I questioned this, she became uncharacteristically emotional, then extraordinarily affectionate. I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right, but I've come too far to start questioning things now. The Malibu house closing is next week, and I've had to move another $800K from our personal accounts. Alexandra will notice soon if I don't create a better cover story. I stared at these words. Richard's private thoughts revealing his own doubts about Elise, his awareness that he was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed, his recognition that he was hiding significant financial decisions from me. "Has the FBI seen this?" I asked. "Yes," David confirmed. "It's part of the evidence being assembled for their case." I returned the tablet, unsure how to feel about this glimpse into Richard's private deliberations. It showed a man who sensed he was being manipulated but continued anyway, who recognized the betrayal of his marriage but persisted in it, who suspected potential security concerns but ignored them. "Thank you, David. Please continue coordinating with the federal investigators." After he left, I turned once more to the window, watching as the rain finally began to clear, patches of blue appearing between clouds. Similarly, the way forward for BQT was gradually becoming clearer, a return to its foundational principles of technical excellence and security integrity, freed from Richard's compromised leadership. The company could be rebuilt. My life could be reconstructed. The offshore millions my father had insisted I maintain separate from my marriage had given me not just financial security in a crisis, but the leverage to protect everything worth salvaging from the wreckage of Richard's betrayal. The rain stopped. Completely, sunlight suddenly illuminating the city with startling clarity. It felt like an appropriate metaphor for my own transformation. From trusting wife to clear-eyed strategist, from background investor to active corporate leader. Richard had emptied our accounts for his mistress, never knowing about my offshore millions. His ignorance had been my salvation, and would be his downfall. 2 weeks after Richard's removal, I sat in the main BQT conference room with Lynn, Sophia, and the leadership team, reviewing our progress and outstanding challenges. The initial crisis had been contained, but new obstacles were emerging as we worked to stabilize the company. "The DoD has conditionally reinstated our contract," Lynn reported, the first piece of genuinely good news we'd had. Their technical review confirmed that our remediation protocols exceed security requirements. "We're on probationary status for 6 months with enhanced oversight, but the core project continues." "That's crucial," I acknowledged. The $1.8 billion contract represented not just revenue but market credibility. Losing it would have devastated BQT's reputation and future prospects. What about the commercial client base? Marcus, who had transitioned from financial investigator to interim chief strategy officer, consulted his tablet. Mixed reactions. We've retained 87% of clients without issue. The remaining 13% have requested enhanced assurances or are considering alternatives. Most concerning is Meridian Financial. They're threatening to switch to quantum solutions from next-gen securities unless we provide significant additional security guarantees. I frowned. Meridian was BQT's largest commercial client, a global financial services firm whose endorsement had helped secure dozens of other corporate clients. Losing them would trigger a dangerous domino effect. What specifically are they asking for? I inquired. Contractual penalties 10 times the normal rate for any security breach, quarterly independent security audits at our expense, and Marcus hesitated. Direct involvement of Alexandra Chen as personal guarantor of system integrity. I raised an eyebrow. They're asking me to put my personal reputation and assets on the line? Essentially, yes. Their CEO, Thomas Wellington, specifically requested your involvement. He said, and I quote, "We trusted BQT because the Chen family was behind it. We need to know that commitment remains." The request was unprecedented, but not entirely surprising. In financial circles, the Chen name carried significant weight. My father had built his reputation on impeccable judgment and absolute integrity. Apparently, that legacy was now being called upon to salvage BQT's relationship with Meridian. Set up a meeting with Wellington, I decided. I'll address his concerns directly. As the meeting continued, other secondary challenges emerged. Key employees being recruited by competitors eager to capitalize on BQT's vulnerability. Media speculation about the company's future creating market uncertainty. Potential class action lawsuits from shareholders claiming the board should have detected Richard's malfeasance sooner. Each issue required careful navigation. We developed contingency plans, assigned response teams, and prioritized interventions based on potential impact. Throughout, I found myself drawing on skills honed during years of investment analysis. The ability to separate critical factors from noise, to identify leverage points where targeted action could yield maximum benefit, to anticipate second and third-order consequences of each decision. As the meeting concluded, Lynn remained behind, waiting until we were alone before speaking. "There's something else you should know," she said, her expression troubled. "The technical team's deep audit of our systems has uncovered evidence that Richard might have been working on a secondary quantum encryption method, something separate from both the DoD project and our commercial products." "What kind of encryption method?" "We're not entirely sure," Lynn admitted. "The files are fragmentary and heavily encrypted themselves. But based on what we've deciphered, it appears to be an implementation of a theoretical approach called homomorphic lattice encryption, something that would allow computations to be performed on encrypted data without ever decrypting it." "That sounds like a significant advance," I observed. "Why would Richard keep it separate from our main research streams?" Lynn hesitated. "That's what concerns me. This particular implementation appears designed specifically for financial applications, cryptocurrency, transfers, anonymous banking, untraceable transactions." The implications were clear. Richard had been developing technology that could facilitate illicit financial movements, perhaps planning his own exit strategy, a way to move money beyond the reach of conventional tracking systems. "Is it operational?" I asked. "We don't believe so. The work appears conceptual rather than implemented. But if Elise Vaughn has copies, it could be developed further." I finished the thought. Lynn nodded grimly. "I've informed the FBI, but I thought you should know directly." After Lynn left, I sat alone in the conference room, processing this new complication. Richard's actions continued to reveal new dimensions of betrayal, not just of me and our marriage, but of the scientific principles that had once defined his work. He had taken his brilliance and perverted it toward deception and escape, rather than advancement and security. My contemplation was interrupted by a call from Sophia. Alexandra, I've just received notice that Richard is fighting extradition from Singapore. His local council has filed emergency motions claiming political persecution. On what basis? I asked, incredulous. They're arguing that the charges are a pretext created by competitors to gain control of his quantum encryption technology. They've specifically named you as orchestrating his downfall to seize control of BQT. The audacity was breathtaking. The evidence of his financial fraud is irrefutable. Yes, but Singapore's courts move deliberately in extradition cases, especially when the defendant has significant resources. His legal team is quite sophisticated, clearly not assembled on short notice. He planned for this contingency, I realized. The emergency extraction, the legal representation in Singapore. This wasn't panic. It was a prepared exit strategy. Exactly, Sophia confirmed. And there's more. Richard has filed emergency motions in New York seeking to freeze all BQT operations, claiming corporate theft of his intellectual property, specifically relating to something called homomorphic lattice encryption. The same technology Lynn had just mentioned. The pieces clicked into place. Richard hadn't just been developing an escape method. He had been creating leverage, proprietary technology he could claim as personal intellectual property rather than corporate assets, something he could use to maintain control even after being removed from the company. How serious is this challenge? I asked. Potentially very serious, Sophia admitted. While Richard's status as fugitive from justice weakens his position, intellectual property claims can create significant complications, especially for a technology company whose primary assets are algorithmic and theoretical rather than physical. I considered our options. We need specialized counsel, the best intellectual property attorneys available, particularly those with expertise in quantum computing applications. I've already reached out to Eliza Montgomery at Frost & Tannenbaum, Sophia replied. She's the leading expert in quantum computing IP law. Good. And we need to accelerate our public communication strategy. Richard is trying to create a narrative of persecution and theft. We need to counter transparency and facts. After ending the call with Sophia, I found myself once again at the window, staring out at the city as evening descended. The offshore. Millions that had initially given me financial independence were now being deployed in a different kind of battle. Legal, reputational, strategic. The resources my father had insisted I maintain separate from my marriage had become the foundation for a much larger defense. My phone buzzed with an incoming text, from a number I didn't recognize. You should have stayed in your lane, Alexandra. Some games are too complex for amateurs. R. Richard, somehow communicating despite being in custody in Singapore. The message carried both a threat and a dismissal, characterizing me as an amateur overstepping my capabilities. It revealed both his continuing arrogance and his fundamental misunderstanding of who I had become. I forwarded the message to Sophia and the FBI without responding directly to Richard. His attempt at intimidation had the opposite effect, crystallizing my resolve. He still saw me as he always had, the supportive wife, the passive investor, the financial administrator to his visionary genius. He had never recognized the strategic mind that had helped build his company, the analytical acumen that had optimized his operations, the determined spirit that had supported his ambitions while maintaining its own integrity. That blindness would be his final miscalculation. I called Marcus. Accelerate the leadership transition planning. Richard is escalating his counterattacks earlier than we anticipated. What specifically do you need? He asked. Everything. Board resolutions affirming Lynn's authority, comprehensive IP documentation showing corporate ownership of all relevant technologies, operational continuity planning that demonstrates the company functions perfectly well without Richard Blackwell. As I ended the call, I felt an unexpected clarity. These secondary challenges, Richard's legal maneuvers, the client concerns, the technical complications, weren't just obstacles to overcome. They were the true test of whether BQT could transcend its founder's failings and emerge as something stronger and more resilient. Richard had emptied our accounts, believing it would leave me vulnerable and dependent. Instead, my offshore millions had given me the resources to fight back. But money alone wasn't enough. This battle would require every skill I'd developed over decades: financial analysis, strategic planning, relationship management, and perhaps most importantly, the courage to stand firmly on principle when others wavered. As night fell over Manhattan, I remained at the window, no longer seeing my reflection superimposed over the darkened skyline, but rather looking clearly at the challenges ahead, and ready to meet them. 1 month after Richard's removal, I sat across from Thomas Wellington, CEO of Meridian Financial, in his opulent office overlooking the Hudson River. The meeting represented a critical juncture for BQT's future, whether our largest commercial client would maintain faith in the company following Richard's betrayal. Wellington was in his 60s, with the sharp eyes and measured speech of someone who had navigated countless financial crises. He had known my father well, both as business associate and occasional golf partner. "Alexandra," he began dispensing, with formalities. "I appreciated your detailed technical briefing yesterday. Your team made a compelling case for the security enhancements, but my concerns go beyond technical specifications." "You're worried about leadership stability," I suggested. "Precisely. Quantum encryption isn't just technology, it's trust. For 15 years, BQT meant Richard Blackwell. His removal, however justified, creates uncertainty." I nodded, acknowledging the concern without defensiveness. Richard founded BQT, but he didn't build it alone. The core encryption protocols were primarily developed by Dr. Lin Wei and her team. The operational infrastructure was created by executives who remain with the company, and the initial funding, the foundation that made it all possible, came from my family through Chen Global Investments. Wellington's expression remained impassive. "Your family's investment was certainly significant, but Richard was the face, the visionary. The supposed visionary who compromised your financial data by enabling backdoor access," I replied, more sharply than intended. Wellington raised an eyebrow, not disputing this point, which brings me to my central question. Why should Meridian maintain its relationship with BQT? Next-Gen Securities is offering comparable technology with aggressive pricing and leadership that hasn't recently been implicated in espionage. The moment had come to play my strongest card. Because BQT's quantum encryption algorithms remain superior, a fact your own technical team acknowledged in yesterday's review. Because the security vulnerabilities have been not just fixed, but fortified. And because the Chen family is increasing its investment in BQT rather than retreating. I slid a document across the table, the term sheet for a significant new investment, from Chen Global Investments, using funds from my offshore trust, $20 million in fresh capital, specifically for enhanced security research and implementation. A clear vote of confidence in BQT's future. Wellington studied the document with the practiced eye of someone who had evaluated countless investment proposals. Impressive, but financial commitment doesn't necessarily ensure operational excellence. Which is why I'm also assuming the role of executive chairperson, I replied. Lin Wei continues as CEO, focusing on technological innovation and client solutions, while I ensure governance, strategy, and financial stability. Taking a page from your father's playbook, Wellington observed, James always believed in hands-on oversight of critical investments. Some lessons prove their value over time, I acknowledged. Wellington was silent for a moment, then asked the question that likely had been his purpose all along. And what happens when Richard returns? Singapore won't hold him forever. His legal team is formidable. If Richard returns to face justice in the United States, he will find a company transformed, stronger governance, enhanced security protocols, and leadership focused on client trust rather than personal enrichment. I met Wellington's gaze directly. What he will not find is a path back to control. The board has unanimously approved a governance structure that prevents any individual, including major shareholders, from circumventing security and compliance protocols. Wellington's expression shifted slightly, the first hint of approval. And the intellectual property claims? His legal filings suggest he personally owns key elements of the encryption technology. Those claims are being systematically dismantled, I replied confidently. Our IP Council has assembled comprehensive documentation showing all relevant technologies were developed using company resources during company time by teams rather than individuals. Richard's contributions were significant, but not exclusive, and certainly not independent of BQT as a corporate entity. Wellington nodded slowly, then reached a decision. Meridian will maintain its relationship with BQT, subject to the enhanced security protocols discussed yesterday and quarterly reviews for the next year. He extended his hand. Your father would be proud, Alexandra. He always said you had both his analytical mind and your mother's backbone. As I left Meridian's offices, I received a call from Sophia. Alexandra, we've had a major development. Singapore's High Court has rejected Richard's petition to block extradition. He'll be returned to U.S. custody within 72 hours. The news sent a complicated ripple of emotions through me. Satisfaction that Richard would face justice, concern about the media scrutiny his return would generate, and a strange sense of closure. The man who had shared my life for 15 years would soon be back on American soil. No longer my husband, but a defendant facing serious federal charges. There's more, Sophia continued. The FBI has located Elise Vaughn. She was detained attempting to enter Vietnam using a false passport. Initial reports suggest she was carrying significant digital assets, including technical documentation from BQT. The espionage angle confirmed, I noted. Apparently so. Agent Donovan has requested a meeting tomorrow to discuss implications. After ending the call, I directed my driver to BQT headquarters rather than back to my apartment. The day's developments warranted immediate discussion with Lynn and the leadership team. I found them already gathered in the main conference room, having received similar updates from their respective contacts. Richard's extradition changes our timeline, Lynn observed after we'd reviewed the facts. We need to accelerate the public narrative before his return dominates the news cycle, Marcus agreed. The profile piece in the Wall Street Journal is scheduled for next week. We should move it up if possible, establish BQT's new direction before Richard's legal drama overshadows everything. Make it happen, I instructed, and prepare a clear statement about the extradition, factual, unemotional, focused on the company's cooperation with authorities and our commitment to moving forward under new leadership. As the team dispersed to implement these adjustments, Lynn remained behind. There's something else you should see, she said, sliding a tablet across the table. The screen displayed technical documentation I didn't immediately understand, complex quantum algorithms and code structures. What am I looking at? I asked. That complete homomorphic encryption system Richard was developing, Lynn explained. Our team finally decrypted the protected files. It's remarkable work, actually. Potentially revolutionary for secure financial transactions. The system he claimed as personal IP rather than company property, I noted. Yes, but here's the interesting part. Lynn highlighted a section of code. This core algorithm, it's adapted from work I did 3 years ago, work that was fully documented in BQT's research database and covered by my employment agreement. Richard modified it significantly, but the foundational approach is unquestionably derived from my earlier research. Understood the significance immediately. So his IP claim is fundamentally flawed, Lynn confirmed. He built on company-owned research using company resources during his tenure as CEO. His contributions are brilliant, but legally, they belong to BQT. This definitively refutes his legal challenge, I realized. Lynn nodded. Completely. Our attorneys are preparing the formal response now. As Lynn left, I remained in the conference room, absorbing the implications of these developments. Richard's return to face justice, Elise's capture with incriminating evidence, the conclusive refutation of Richard's intellectual property claims, Meridian Financial's decision to maintain its relationship with BQT. Piece by piece, the foundation for BQT's future was solidifying. My phone chimed with an incoming email from Richard, routed through his legal team. Alexandra, before returning to face what I'm sure will be a media circus and legal battlefield, I wanted to communicate directly. What began as poor judgment on my part evolved into something I never intended. Elise was not who she claimed to be, and I became entangled in a situation that spiraled beyond my control. I never meant to betray our company or our marriage. I recognize that words are inadequate to address the damage done, but I hope eventually you might consider that 15 years of partnership shouldn't be entirely negated by even severe mistakes. Richard. I read the message twice, recognizing the carefully crafted narrative. Richard as victim of circumstances and manipulation. Rather than perpetrator of deliberate fraud and betrayal, there was probably some truth to this perspective. Elise had indeed targeted him as part of an intelligence operation, but it conveniently overlooked his willing participation once the relationship began, his systematic deception regarding company, funds, and his deliberate draining of our personal accounts. I forwarded the email to Sophia without replying to Richard, then turned my attention to the press statement about his impending return. The company needed to project confidence and continuity rather than being drawn into Richard's attempt to reframe the narrative. As evening fell, I stood at the window of what was now officially my office at BQT headquarters, no longer a temporary space but the permanent base for my role as executive chairperson. The position represented a significant evolution in my professional life, a shift from behind-the-scenes investor to public corporate leader. The offshore millions that had given me financial independence during the crisis had now been partially deployed to strengthen BQT's future, a strategic investment that simultaneously increased Chen Global's ownership stake and provided crucial capital for security enhancements. Richard had emptied our accounts for his mistress, never imagining I had resources he couldn't touch. That ignorance had given me the freedom to act decisively when his betrayal was discovered. Now, as he returned to face justice, he would find both his former company and his former wife transformed by the very crisis he had created, stronger, more resilient, and completely beyond his control. The final resolution wasn't just about legal proceedings or corporate governance. It was about reclaiming narrative control over BQT's future, over my professional identity, and over the story of what happened when a brilliant but flawed man betrayed both his marriage and his company. Richard had believed himself the protagonist. In this story, the visionary creator temporarily led astray. He was about to discover that the true protagonist had been beside him all along, underestimated and overlooked until the moment when everything changed. 6 months after Richard's removal, I stood at the podium in BQT's newly renovated auditorium, addressing the assembled employees, board members, and select media representatives. The company had just completed its most successful quarter ever, with the DoD contract fully reinstated and commercial client retention exceeding all projections. Today marks not just the end of a challenging period, I began, looking out at the attentive faces, but the beginning of BQT's next evolution. The security breaches that threatened this company have become the catalyst for developing the most robust encryption systems in the industry. The leadership crisis that shook our foundations has given rise to a governance structure that ensures no single individual, including myself, can ever compromise our collective mission. The journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. Richard's return to the United States had indeed created the media circus we'd anticipated. Breathless coverage of the quantum trader, whose brilliance had allegedly been manipulated by a foreign operative. His legal team had mounted an aggressive defense, portraying him as a victim rather than perpetrator, a narrative that gained some traction in the press but fell apart under scrutiny in the courtroom. 3 months ago, Richard had accepted a plea agreement, guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement, in exchange for cooperation with ongoing counterintelligence investigations. The espionage charges were set aside, not because he was innocent, but because prosecutors determined Elise Vaughn was the primary actor. Richard now faced 8 to 10 years in federal prison, a significant financial restitution order, and the permanent loss of his role in the company he'd co-founded. The quantum encryption technology developed in these offices remains the gold standard for security worldwide, I continued in my address. Not because we claim infallibility, recent events have certainly proven our capacity for error, but because we've learned that true security comes from systematic verification, distributed authority, and unwavering commitment to integrity at every level. As I spoke, I was acutely aware of how my own life had transformed alongside the company. The penthouse I'd shared with Richard had been sold, the proceeds divided according to our divorce settlement, significantly favoring me given the documented financial misconduct. I'd purchased a smaller but elegant apartment in Tribeca, a space entirely my own, decorated according to my aesthetic rather than our compromised preferences. More significant than these external changes was my internal evolution. The woman who had once defined herself partly through her marriage to a brilliant physicist turned entrepreneur had reclaimed her identity as Alexandra Chen, daughter of immigrants who built a financial empire, financial strategist who helped shape quantum technology's commercial application, corporate leader navigating a historic crisis toward unprecedented success. Today, I'm pleased to announce that BQT is launching the Quantum Resilience Initiative, a $50 million program developing next-generation security systems specifically designed for critical infrastructure protection. This announcement, the culmination of months of work by Lynn and her technical team, represented BQT's future direction, leveraging our hard-won lessons about security vulnerabilities into technologies that would protect power grids, water systems, and transportation networks from increasingly sophisticated cyber threats. The funding came partially from company reserves, partially from a new investment round led by Chen Global Investments. My offshore millions, once a personal safety net, had become a strategic asset deployed to secure BQT's future and strengthen my family's position within the company. After the formal presentation, I mingled with employees and board members, accepting congratulations and discussing future plans. Lynn joined me as the crowd began to disperse. "Impressive reception," she observed. "The stock price jumped 3% during your speech." I smiled. "The markets appreciate clarity and direction. We're providing both." Lynn nodded, then hesitated, before asking the question that still occasionally surfaced in quiet moments. "Have you heard from him?" Richard. Even now, 6 months later, his name remained largely unspoken between those of us who had navigated the aftermath of his betrayal, referred to obliquely as him, or sometimes the former CEO. His attorney contacted Sophia last week, I acknowledged. Apparently he's writing some kind of memoir and wants to ensure he's not violating any remaining confidentiality provisions. "A memoir," Lynn repeated skeptically. "Reinventing himself as the misunderstood genius?" "Something like that." Sophia informed him that any manuscript would require review by BQT's legal team before publication. "I doubt we'll hear more about it." Truth was, Richard's attempt to reshape his narrative held little interest for me now. The man who had occupied such a central position in my life for 15 years had become increasingly peripheral, a cautionary tale rather than an active presence. Later that evening, I hosted a small dinner at my new apartment for the core team, who had helped navigate BQT through its darkest days: Lynn, Sophia, Marcus, and David. As we enjoyed a meal prepared by a private chef, overlooking the Hudson River bathed in sunset colors, The conversation turned reflective. 6 months ago, I wasn't sure the company would survive, David admitted, swirling wine in his glass. The security breaches seemed too fundamental, the leadership crisis too severe. I was more concerned about Alexandra than the company, Sophia confessed, glancing at me. Finding out your husband has drained your accounts for his mistress would devastate most people. I considered this. It would have devastated me too, if not for my father's insistence on maintaining separate resources. Those offshore millions weren't just financial security, they represented independence of action when I needed it most. Your father was remarkably prescient, Lynn observed. Not prescient, I corrected gently. Just experienced. He'd seen how quickly circumstances can change, how relationships presumed solid can fracture. He wanted to ensure I always had options. As the evening progressed, our conversation shifted from past challenges to future possibilities. Lynn's vision for quantum encryption's evolution, Marcus's strategies for market expansion, David's innovations in security architecture. The trauma of Richard's betrayal hadn't disappeared, but it had been integrated into a larger narrative of resilience and renewal. After my guests departed, I stood on my terrace watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky. 6 months earlier, I had awakened to a notification of unusual account activity, the first indication that my husband was systematically betraying our marriage and the company we'd built together. That moment had triggered a cascade of discoveries and decisions that transformed nearly every aspect of my life. Richard had emptied our accounts for his mistress, believing he was leaving me vulnerable and dependent. He couldn't have been more wrong. The offshore millions my father had insisted I maintain had given me not just financial security, but strategic leverage, the ability to act decisively when crisis struck, to protect what mattered most, to rebuild on stronger foundations. More valuable than the money itself was the mindset it represented, the understanding that true security comes not from dependency, but from autonomy, not from blind trust, but from clear-eyed assessment, not from avoiding challenges, but from developing the resources to meet them effectively. My phone chimed with a message from an overseas investment partner, a quantum technology application, developer in Tokyo interested in potential collaboration with BQT. Even at this hour, opportunities continued to emerge. This was the nature of resilience, the capacity to transform setbacks into springboards, crises into catalysts for growth. Replied to the message, suggesting a video conference the following week to explore possibilities. Then I returned my attention to the city spread before me, a landscape of light and shadow, opportunity and challenge, endings and beginnings. Richard had betrayed everything we'd built together, but in doing so, he had inadvertently released me to build something stronger, a company defined by integrity rather than individual brilliance, a life shaped by autonomy rather than accommodation, a future limited only by my vision and determination. He had emptied our accounts, never knowing about my offshore millions. In the end, his ignorance had been my salvation, and his downfall. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.